How's it going, everybody? I'm back after another lull. I had a move to take care of, but that is mercifully in the rear view, so hopefully I can start uploading a little bit more content before I take off to Europe next month. That's a whole other thing, but we'll live in the now. And today I am talking about Hard Target, the John Woo film starring Van Damme from 1993. Now, Hard Target is not only one of my favorite Van Damme films, it's also one of my favorite John Woo films. To just give you a little bit of background here as far as John Woo is concerned, he was a director that I got really into when I was young, like 18, 19, all the way into my early 20s. Then as time went on, my taste for him softened a little bit. I'm not a John Woo completionist at this point by any stretch. But I have sort of come full circle again and learned to appreciate some of the things about his films that maybe I didn't fully grasp when I first was introduced to him as a young sprite. While some of his movies have certainly not aged on me completely successfully, I can still appreciate that the style over substance approach that he frankly took to a lot of his films was actually probably the right way to go about movies, at least according to an action genre like this. For a long time, I always thought of Face Off as being John Woo's best American film, but I gotta be honest with you, going back and watching segments from it the last little while, I don't really feel like it's aged all that well. Just the sheer goofiness of the high concept science fiction aspect of the plot, combined with the hamminess of John Travolta's performance and Nick Cage's as well, doesn't really add up to something that translates well in 2024, at least not in my opinion. Interestingly, John Woo did initially turn this project down when it was first offered to him precisely because he didn't really buy into the sci-fi aspects of the film. Evidently, he loosened his grip on that position, but I kind of wish he had stayed a little bit more strict about his filmmaking philosophy, because let's face it, no pun intended, I think that's just a bit of a slip there, Face Off does not really hold up that well at this point. It's a bit of a goofy fucking movie. Not the worst thing John Woo's ever made, and certainly not the worst action movie of the 90s, and not even Nicolas Cage or John Travolta's worst movie, respectively. Just the general style at play in that movie, it really does feel like a product of its decade. Hard Target, on the other hand, because it's relatively small and earnest in scale, and is a much more pared down, pure, unapologetic action movie, it translates to a much better rewatch in the modern age. I mean, aside from the lack of digital technology, although to be perfectly honest, I'll bet you could pretty much shoot this script scene for scene, line for line today, and pretty much if you wanted to, just ignore the lack of cell phones, don't worry about trying to factor that in. And I think that most people would still be willing to go with it. With housing and homelessness being even more of an issue now than it was back in the early 90s, it's not that hard to envision this working for a modern audience. In fact, issues of homelessness and housing and just the general sort of collapse of our traditional institutions seems to be with us more now than ever. So if anything, I feel like the general themes and premise of this one would probably feel even more pertinent today. It's also worth noting that this was in fact the first Hollywood feature film to be directed by a Chinese filmmaker. Hong Kong action directors like Woo and Ringo Lam and Sue Hark were all very much what the hipster action fans were watching back in the late 80s and early 90s. And Van Damme was apparently much more keen than a lot of his other action colleagues of that time to be working with these folks, because if you track it, John Woo, Sue Hark, and Ringo Lam, and I'm probably leaving a couple more out. The point is, though, that they all got their first crossover film in North America working with good old JCVD. I don't know much about Van Damme's relationship with Sue Hark or Ringo Lam, respectively, but I do know that he was very insistent on John Woo coming over to direct this film. He went out of his way to meet with John Woo and persuade him to be the filmmaker. This was a good 30 years before celebrating and recognizing Asian talent in Hollywood was fashionable, so yeah, as much as I like to kid Van Damme, as much as we all like to kid Van Damme, you can't deny that he did play a pretty integral role in helping Asian filmmakers start to get some traction in the Hollywood scene. Sam Raimi's involvement in this project is also something that should be respected and appreciated as well. First of all, like Van Damme, he had an affection for Hong Kong cinema before that was cool. And interestingly, he was initially attached to this project partly because the other producers were concerned that John Woo, whether it was because of the language barrier or not being used to the Hollywood system, they were just a little bit concerned that he might not be able to cut it, and if he couldn't, they wanted Sam Raimi there to be able to take up the director's reins if something didn't quite pan out. Fortunately, his respect for John Woo and his affection for Hong Kong cinema meant that Sam Raimi did everything in his power to protect and support John Woo through the making of this film. I do have to wonder what the Sam Raimi version of Hard Target would look like. I mean, I don't know about the rest of you. Personally, I would be all for Bruce Campbell duking it out with Lance Henriksen and Arnold Vosloo in an action movie set in New Orleans, but hey, I digress. It sounds perverse, but honestly, I feel like John Woo is a filmmaker who really shines when he injects his ambition into the style rather than the substance of his films. A little bit like M. Night Shyamalan, John Woo's best movies all involve exceedingly, almost stupidly simple plots that he just elevates and spices up with a lot of artfully placed slow motion and just a lot of techniques that go really all the way back to the French New Wave. A lot of it is stuff that doesn't really even involve After Effects or a lot of fancy editing sweet trickery. It's mostly just the way that he edits the various shots together. So if you don't feel like shelling out the monthly bill for Creative Cloud or whatever other suite you're using, and you still want to learn how to give your movie a sense of flair and style and just some very distinct individual flavor, give some of the old John Woo movies a watch. Like, the guy really was kind of a genius in his own way when it came to just juxtaposing slow motion, regular motion, and a lot of other basic techniques that when you mix them together and you place and edit them correctly, work to wonderful effect to elevate a simple scene into something that feels a little bit more interesting and entertaining. The supporting cast in this movie is pretty much perfect. Lance Henriksen and Arnold Vosloo are both really good villains. Vosloo in particular does a good job, I think, of just not trying to ham it up too much or even to sort of steal any scenes or try and make the character more than it is on the page. He always stays within the context of what is written for him as Pick Van Cleef, and he just allows his signature dark presence and sort of glowering menace to characterize this hitman and make him memorable for the audience, but again, never more than is needed for his role. He just lets his presence speak for itself, and I think that that was a very smart choice on his part. It's hard to know for sure, I guess, just because his character does seem in some aspects to have suffered in the editing just a little bit. That's not to say that this movie in its final form does not feel like a well-oiled machine, but he's definitely a character I would have liked to have got to know just a little bit better if I had my choice. Lance Henriksen is similarly a guy who knows how to do a lot with a little, although if you've seen this movie, you know that by the end, he is all too happy to just start gnashing that scenery like an angry alligator. Fortunately, Lance Henriksen is such a pro and he embodies the role so well that you do find him convincing the entire time, and I think that that's what sort of saves his performance from being so hammy that it's distracting. I mean, his character is doing a lot of really supremely goofy shit in this movie, but because you buy that this guy is that much of a loop-de-loo, it's what sort of brings it back from the brink of being sort of a bit too overblown and operatic of a performance for its own good. I also really enjoy Yancy Butler as Natasha in this. She is obviously still an attractive woman, but it sort of feels more sort of real world attractive, you might say. Like, she actually, in her appearance and the way that she dresses and is groomed and the way she's made up and shot, feels like someone who you could actually run into in the street and not an impossibly attractive heroine who just stepped off of the cover of Vogue or Elle magazine or something. Any aspect of the script that directly hinted at romance between her and Van Damme's character Chance was essentially all excised from the final cut of the movie, and I think that's just as well, because not only does it make both the characters a little bit more dignified, but it makes them a little bit more credible. I mean, I think that John Woo probably recognized that it doesn't really make sense that two people are going to fall into bed together, especially not when their relationship up until then has essentially just consisted of dodging bullets. It also makes Chance feel a little bit more sort of respectable and less narcissistic than the typical Van Damme protagonist. And to give credit to the man himself for this due, this is one of Van Damme's better performances from this era in my opinion. Probably the least Van Damme-y performance he turned in the 90s. Nothing Oscar winning obviously, but it still feels like he's actually sort of playing more of a character here to me. And of course, how could I forget about Wilford Brimley as Chance's Uncle Duvet, who lives out in a cabin in the bayou making whiskey. Wilford Brimley pretty much steals every scene that he's in once he shows up, and I mean once he shows up, it's almost like he's determined to turn this movie into a scenery eating contest between himself and Lance Henriksen. And if you're gonna chew the scenery as well as two old pros like Wilford Brimley and Lance Henriksen can, you know what? Fine by me. The heck with it. Hand them the scenery and a knife and fork all on a platter, let them go to town. Name me one other movie from any era, not just the 90s, okay, but any era, where in the space of less than a minute, you are treated to the guilty pleasure smorgasbord of Arnold Vosloo and Lance Henriksen making their best glowering evil man constipated faces, plus Wilford Brimley running away from an exploding fireball on horseback with a bow and arrow over his head while he bellows incoherent Cajun slurs at the top of his lungs. None, that's how many. Hard Target never really takes itself too seriously. That's not to say it's a spoof or a Rodriguez-style action movie, but little things from moments like what I just described with Brimley to the musical score and just a few other little knowing winks that are there in the background send the message that this was designed to be essentially a light romp that was just pure fun. And it is a lot of fun. That humble sense of importance and purpose and that general earnestness is what gives this movie its charm and what makes it such a dependable movie for me to rewatch. It's not here to revolutionize the genre or reinvent the wheel. It's just here to be a pure action movie with no frills that honestly feels a lot like a modern Western before that became a popular phrase. Is the plot element of the citywide police strike more than a little convenient with regards to that? Of course it is, but the hell with it, all the better to just cut the crap and get to the action. Even with Van Damme famously going back in to re-edit the film to try and give his character Chance even more emphasis in the final cut. I mean, I think that okay, fine, granted, you gotta take everything you read online with a grain of salt, but I remember reading, I think on Wikipedia, that Van Damme's words to one of the producers or someone or other when he was applying his own edits to the film, his rationalization was, people aren't paying to see Lance Henriksen, they're paying to see me. You bet they are. Couldn't they be paying to see you both, Van Damme? I mean, it's not like you're the world's first movie star, God knows. Despite all that interference from Van Damme in the final cut, this still to me feels much more like a John Woo film than a Van Damme film. And you can sense that Van Damme's respect for Woo as a filmmaker really did help keep him in check while they were making this movie. Or at least while they were on set shooting. The action set pieces in this movie never quite reach the heights of something that you might have seen in, say, Hard Boiled, or The Killer, or A Better Tomorrow for that matter. But at the same time, I can still appreciate how most of the action scenes in this film do always serve the story to some extent. They always have some consequences. It's not like, with a couple exceptions, like they're just being thrown in there for the sake of having more Van Damme action. It's certainly been documented at this point that things like that did occur while they were making this movie as well. Although, if I'm being totally honest, as far as gratuitous Van Damme action scenes go, the one that you get early on in this movie where he's fighting off those muggers who are trying to take Natasha's purse and possibly assault her, it's one of the better ones. As far as unnecessary Van Damme action moments go, this one probably ranks near the top for me. It is quite well choreographed. The guitar score in that scene and throughout the movie really is a little bit obnoxious in places maybe, but I can let that go because the tone of the score does complement the tone of the film and serves as a reminder that this is in essence still just being done in fun. I really would have enjoyed seeing Van Damme and John Woo work together again, I'm not gonna lie. More broadly, the whole premise of people paying vast sums of money for the opportunity to hunt another human being is the sort of thing that has been around for a long time, but because it experienced a resurgence over the course of the last decade with movies like The Hunger Games and The Purge, Rob Zombie's 31, Belko Experiment, Battle Royale, and so forth, it probably would find a good niche audience for itself if it was released today. Also, on a side note, that's actually the movie's screenwriter Chuck Ferrer playing Natasha's dad who's killed in the opening sequence, in case you didn't know. This is one of those movies like Con Air where I can just put it on if it's raining out or I've had a bad day or I'm just not feeling that great for whatever reason, and it just spreads through my body and warms me like a Neocitrin. I know there was a sequel with Scott Adkins that was released relatively recently. I won't pretend to really know a whole hell of a lot about that. I do like Scott Adkins a lot, but at this point, who is even asking for a sequel to Hard Target anyway? Plus, Scott Adkins does definitely have his niche audience carved out at this point and a pretty loyal fan base, so I don't really see why anyone thought it was necessary to piggyback off this movie to get that one made. But don't knock it until you've actually watched it, obviously. I mean, for all I know, I could go out and watch Hard Target 2 tomorrow and be back here in a couple of days telling you guys how it's The Godfather Part 2 of action films. But I doubt it. And have Scott Adkins and John Woo ever collaborated, by the way? Because if not, that does need to happen. And there you have it. In my opinion, Hard Target remains one of John Woo's best American films, if not his best. I do wish that John Woo and Van Damme had done some other collaborations, but given how well this one holds up today, I have a feeling it's going to continue to retain a cult following in the coming decades. Hard Target was a blast to watch the first time I saw it, and it remains a blast now. So thank you so much for watching, guys. Look for a couple other uploads in the coming days, and I will see you next time.